Hi, my name is Mike Treder. I'm the Managing Director at the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, and I'm here today to do a Blogging Heads conversation with Massimo Pigliucci. Massimo, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm a professor of philosophy at the City University of New York, and in my previous career I was an evolutionary biologist, last time at the Stony Brook University.
Great, okay. And the topic of our conversation today is going to be transhumanism. What is transhumanism, and what might be right about it, what might be wrong about it. In terms of background, I am a transhumanist. I call myself that. I have been active within transhumanist groups for about 10 years or so. I just recently stepped down from the board of directors of an organization called Humanity Plus, which used to be the World Transhumanist Association. I was one of the 5 original founding board members of that group when it started about 10 years ago. And as I said, I'm now with the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, which is an organization that deals with transhumanist issues, although we say that we take it from what we call a techno-progressive perspective. We can discuss the fine distinctions there if we like. But so this whole conversation came about because of an article that you wrote last year, Massimo, on the problems I don't remember if it was the problems of transhumanism, problems with transhumanism, but
something like that.
So why don't you maybe get started by telling us what's wrong with transhumanism?
Yeah, so you're referring to an article, a brief post that I had on my blog, rationallyspeaking.org, and the point of the post wasn't necessarily to mount a comprehensive critique of transhumanism, for one thing, because a blog is certainly not the best way to do it, and for other, because I am not a radical critic of transhumanism either. I tend to like technology, as it's clear from the fact that I'm using a laptop computer and talking to you via internet connection. And I also consider myself, broadly speaking, a son of the Enlightenment. I mean, I do, and I am an atheist. I don't I don't have religious objections to transhumanism or anything like that. However, I am a scientist, and I have a certain appreciation for science, and I also am a philosopher, and therefore I have an appreciation for both ethical issues and what philosophers call epistemological issues, which is issues about the limit of human knowledge. So I tend to be a little bit skeptical of positions that I see verging on, let's say, scientism or techno-optimism. As you know, scientism is the idea that it's a position that is taken by people who are overly optimistic about the achievements of science.
Right.
And, science is a great thing, and it's done a lot of good stuff for us, but it also has caused some significant problems for human society. We can start mentioning things from nuclear weapons to environmental pollution to begin with. So science by itself isn't going to solve problems. Science is going to provide us certain options, and some certain options those options are going to be good. Some of those options are potentially much more dangerous and much more, and we need to be much more careful about it. And I guess what I don't share is what I perceive as both a technological optimism that underlies the transhumanist movement, and also, frankly, perhaps even more importantly, optimism about human nature. I think that with great powers come great responsibility, and we already have a lot of power in terms of, as human beings, and we're not exactly using it very well already. So I'm not convinced that even more power and more control over our future and the future of this planet is necessarily an unconditional good.
I understand, and you may not be aware that part of the purpose of founding an organization that was to deal with what we call transhumanist issues was to explore not only the upside, the optimistic scenarios for how human enhancement and other transformative technologies might benefit the world in general, but also to look at the negative consequences, the dangers, especially what you might call the existential risks of powerful new emerging technologies. As you said, we're not very good yet at dealing with a lot of powerful technologies. And if our technologies continue to become more and more potent, and especially if they become more and more available to smaller groups who might, be irresponsible with them, then those are things we need to look at.
No, you're right. I mean, I'm aware of the fact that within the transhumanist movement, there have been discussions about, first of all, the objections that are typically raised on both practical as well as sort of ethical grounds. And I'm also aware that transhumanists do have discussions, therefore, about the possible negative consequences of their philosophies. But in admittedly cursory reading of the literature that I did in preparation for this conversation left me with the difficult to shake impression that those discussions are really a minor component of what's going on. That there seems to be, optimism seems to be the prevalent attitude. And again, I don't have anything against optimism per se. I think it's a pretty good idea. But being overly optimistic about what, after all, are incredibly complex issues, both technological, scientific, and ethical, it strikes me as potentially dangerous or naive.
Well, you raise a good point, I think, that a cursory look at transhumanism and at some of the sites that promote transhumanist issues can give you the impression that all transhumanists, or at least most transhumanists, are unrealistic and perhaps naive techno-optimists, even technophiles who embrace technology as an unmitigated good. And it's unfortunate, in my view, that there are many people who give that impression. And I have, in my tenure among leadership in transhumanist organizations, have tried to kind of push back against that a little bit. And yet, I certainly am not somebody who would say technology is bad, or progress is bad, although I think those questions need to be raised. But I also, I guess one of the things that struck me about what you wrote that first brought your ideas to my attention last year was when you were criticizing, I think it was an article about ending aging, or radical life extension, where we might be able to take the healthy, vigorous lifespan of an individual and stretch it out, where people would live longer and healthier and better lives. And obviously there are the usual objections to that about overpopulation and so on. But if you can go past those sort of practical objections, do you have any moral or ethical objections to the idea that humans should live as long as possible?
Well, first of all, I don't like the word morality because of its sort of religious undertones. So I prefer to talk about ethics, although the distinction is sometimes a little too subtle for general discussions. But yes, I do have ethical issues. But I think we need to make a couple of points first. First of all, you said, let's get past the practical issues. Well, the practical issues are huge. And for instance, overpopulation. I was just reading yesterday, just coincidentally, for one of my classes. I teach a class at CUNY now on problems of philosophy. And entirely coincidentally, yesterday we talked about immortality. Mm-hmm. And so in preparation for that class, I was reading some literature to the effect that some transhumanists are obviously conscious of the overpopulation problem, and they're thinking about possible solutions. But what I read was always cast in terms of, well, maybe we can somehow give incentives to people to reproduce less, for instance. Well, number one, those incentives have so far not worked very well. I mean, look at the overpopulation problem we already have. But the other thing is, if you're actually talking about immortality as opposed to life extension, those are very different things, right? I mean, I think very few people, including me, are going to be against, certainly not me, are going to be against life extension to some level, to some extent. But immortality is a radically different concept. And if you're talking about immortality, even a reproductive rate that is going to be very, very low, eventually, inevitably, it's going to lead to an infinite population size.
Right.
Because you have an infinite amount of time, presumably, or at least essentially infinite, limited at that point only by the life of the universe.
Right.
So the population problem is, I think, a serious one. And of course, overpopulation, I think, today is arguably the main problem that we face, because all of the other ones, pollution, environmental disasters, to some extent, poverty and inequality, they're largely stem out of a problem of overpopulation, or at least are connected to a problem of overpopulation. Right. So, but let's set that aside for a second, as you suggested, and let's talk about sort of the ethical problem. I don't have ethical problems as in, that might be the kind of ethical problems that might be raised by a religious person, like, where we're trying to be God, or where it's somehow immoral to intervene in human biology. Of course not. First of all, since I don't believe in God, I don't see any problem in offending gods by engaging in this kind of behavior. Second, we have medicine already. I mean, we already have life extension and life improvement technologies, and I'm certainly all in favor of it. The question, however, becomes interesting when we're talking about radical improvements, as opposed to prolonging lifetime and quality of life, which of course it's a different issue. But if we're talking about improving quality and length of life to a certain degree, X, I don't think there's a big deal there. But if we're talking about radical improvement, radical prolongation of life, and essentially with the goal of immortality, now we're getting into situations where I don't think we have a good idea of what would happen under those conditions. I think we're running, for instance, there's a classic philosophical objection to immortality that is called, it's known as the Macropolis problem, and named after a character of a novel. And the Macropolis problem is the idea that human beings, because of the psychology of a human being, because of the way we are, because of the fundamental aspects of human nature, would essentially experience a living hell if they really were immortal. The argument being that if you're immortal, if you take immortality seriously, what that means is that for all effective purposes, you're going to run into a life that it's going to look a lot like a Groundhog Day. Right. I'm referring to the movie. Right. Not just one day, of course, but an entire lifetime. After a while, you will, in fact, have experienced pretty much every experience that is worth experiencing, everything that is worth doing. You will have done it several times over, then a lot of times over, then many, many, many times over, and at which point it's hard to see, A, how a human psychology would deal with that, and B, what would be the meaning of that kind of life.
Well, could we take the concept, the sort of Christian or religious concept of immortality, meaning endless life that cannot end or will not end, if we take that off the table, because I think that's it's unrealistic. The universe will end at some point, and so all life will end with the eventual. We expect is the eventual heat death of the universe in some trillions of years.
Okay.
And I prefer, rather than to use the term immortality, which I think is it's overly vague, and B, it's open to all kinds of objections, some of which you just raised. I prefer to say that it would be ideal if we could make both aging and death optional. That is, death might eventually, be unavoidable, but in the very long run for humans, it would be great if death was optional. That is, you could choose it if you got tired, bored, as you said, but that you wouldn't have to die unless you decided it was time for you to die. And therefore, as long as you find pleasure and enjoyment and learning and growth, or whatever it is that you want to get out of life, as long as you find that available, then I see no reason why you should not be allowed to have your life continue.
Right. But so we're talking then about, again, an extension and presumably with a good quality of life, right? Right. Now, but the psychological problem remains. I mean, let me put it to you in somewhat of a joking way, but the point is actually serious. I hear people talking about immortality or radical extension of the duration of life, and then we have a modern society, especially in the United States, where people literally don't know what to do with their time on a Sunday morning. Right. So how is that going to work into that life? Because it does highlight a problem of human psychology, it seems to me.
Well, but on that basis of that reasoning, then why should those people who aren't enjoying life right now be allowed to continue living? I mean, you're saying that we shouldn't allow people to live long because they'll get bored and be depressed. Then why not? Why are those people allowed to live now?
No, that's. I certainly am not suggesting that we shouldn't allow people to live even if they're bored. Sometimes even literally bored to death. But then we get into the social consequences, right? So the ethical component of this is really the social consequences.
Right.
And as you know, there are all sorts of objections in that area, right?
And I think we should talk about those. I mean, if we can say that from an ethical standpoint, philosophically speaking, there's no reason why a person shouldn't be allowed to live the life that they choose for as long as they choose, assuming that it's physically possible. Can we sort of stipulate that?
Well, no, because I don't think that individual rights are independent of social rights. So I'm not willing to stipulate that. I think that the two are unfortunately inextricably related.
Well, then let's talk about the environmental overpopulation and social and economic issues that could be raised from if it's possible. Let's say in 50 years' time, or at whatever length of time, if it's possible in the next millennium, for humans to live much, much longer than the current lifespan, to live for 10,000 years instead of for 80 years. Okay. What are the issues that raises, and are they bad enough that if it's possible for humans to have much longer lifespans, are there good reasons why we should put a limit on how long people can be allowed to live?
Well, I think we're already seeing the problem. We already have seen a significant increase in human lifespan, at least in some human societies,
right.
Over the last century or two, and we are seeing the problems. We've had a population explosion. We have an environmental problem that is as big as it has ever been, and it's threatening now the health of the entire planet's ecosystem. We have an increasing gap between rich and poor, both within and across societies. We have huge issues in terms of, therefore, access to resources, access to medical care, for instance, and so on and so forth. So it seems to me that it's a technological advancement, a further technological advancement, especially one that we're talking about in terms of orders of magnitude, not just a few more years, but tens of hundreds of times the normal lifespan. It seems to me that it will only exacerbate these problems to the point of collapse.
Right.
Now, you can say, well, but we're going to find some kind of solution, I assume technological, to the problem, but that strikes me as techno-optimistic beyond belief.
Well, but do those solutions have to be solely technological? I mean, obviously, we would hope and expect that technology and science will continue to advance and that we will learn better ways of doing things than we are presently doing them. But it seems to me that part of those solutions have to be social, economic, political, etc.
That's right.
Not only technological. I mean, it'd be silly to say technology solves all problems when, as you've eloquently stated it, technology has caused as many problems, or at least a good number of problems, perhaps as many as it has already solved.
Right. But then your point, I completely agree that there has to be social progress, but that only makes, in my opinion, and here perhaps a little bit of a pessimist streak will come out, that only makes the problem worse. Because I think that one can make a reasonable argument that technological progress, especially over the last couple of hundred years, has far outstripped social progress.
Right.
Human beings, for whatever reason, seems to be really difficult to, in terms of embracing social progress. I mean, it does happen. I'm not going to be the sort of the social pessimist that would say that things never improved and we're going to catastrophe no matter what. That seems equally silly to me. But it is certainly a fact of historical record that although some modern societies are arguably the most democratic, the most liberal, and the most egalitarian that have ever been in the history of humanity, that's progress. But it took a huge amount of struggle, a huge amount of time. It's still a very fragile situation, and it's certainly not a worldwide situation by far.
Right. We still have 2/3 of the world that essentially lives day to day, less than $2 a day,
right?
Hand to mouth, suffering terrible, diseases, and
right.
I agree that progress has only benefited about a relatively small percentage of us, a
right.
quarter, a third, a fifth of us, something like that. But still, that is pointing to existing problems and saying, well, we haven't solved those problems now, so what makes us think we can solve them in the future? But on the other hand, I'm still not clear where you're going if you're saying that improving new technologies that can improve individual human lives, that can lengthen them, that can make them richer, and so on. That doesn't solve the problems we have now. Well, I certainly agree with that, but I don't see how the two are necessarily connected, that you should somehow discourage technology or progress that would benefit humans, that would achieve transhumanist aims. How is that in opposition to dealing with the problems of environment and poverty and so on that we should also be dealing with?
Well, because, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, I don't think there is an independence or a decoupling between technological progress and social progress. Technological progress has consequences for society, and vice versa, social structure has consequences for the way we do science and technology. For instance, the way we fund science and technology, what kind of science we fund, what kind of technology we fund. There are several easily conjurable, unfortunately, scenarios where the transhumanist goal can be directed in the directions and into situations which I'm sure you wouldn't particularly enjoy or like or endorse. For instance, there's very obvious military applications
right.
of the sort of things that transhumanists support. And would you be surprised if the military were the first ones to get there and put up the most money? And once the technology for the development of the technology, and once the technology is developed, it's going to be kept for the benefit of that sort of organization as opposed to society at large. I mean, so those are questions that I think they're very serious, independently of the feasibility, of course, of the technological progress. Which, by the way, I also have problems there. I think we should talk at some point or another about the actual technological issues. For instance, I don't know what you think about this idea of uploading people's minds
right.
on computers. I think it's downright silly. So maybe we can have a discussion about that. But there are individual issues in technology that need also to be addressed.
Yeah, I agree with you, at least on the aspect that the more powerful technology becomes, the more susceptible it is to being misused. And those who already have power in society are naturally going to want to maintain and increase their strength. And in particular, it seems the militaries, whether it's the United States or elsewhere, unquestionably are looking. We know that they are looking deeply into what the new potentials of these emerging technologies might be, and those are risks that have to be addressed. And certainly, I would state that the transhumanist movement does not have their eyes closed to that, but in fact, as one of the reasons that we were originally founded was to get people to consider what the longer-term implications are of powerful new technologies potentially being concentrated into the hands of fewer and fewer people. How can we, well, first of all, we need to analyze what the implications are, and if they are negative, as they seem to be, then how can we avoid that outcome? How can we try to distribute power rather than concentrate it?
Right. That's right. So, well, at least we agree that there are really serious social issues. We mentioned the military, but of course there's also corporate control
right. Absolutely.
Of resources.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I started at the beginning saying that I'm part of what we call a techno-progressive organization now, the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies. And our focus is on achieving, on finding ways to use the power of emerging technologies to achieve progressive goals. That is, more equality, better quality of life for everyone, not just for a favored few.
Yeah, I'm glad that the word ethics is in there, yes.
Right. And hopefully we can agree on what those ethics might be, or at least come close to agreement.
I think we might actually have more agreement on the ethical goals,
right.
If not necessarily on how to get there.
Right. But I'm glad you raised that issue of uploading, because we should talk about that. It's something that many transhumanists, have strong feelings about. Most people, many transhumanists look forward to that as a potential outcome. And it's one of the ways in which a sort of an effective immortality might be achieved. Again, with the eventual heat death of the universe, etc., perhaps everything runs down. But over a very long span of time, if it's possible for a human personality, for your sort of individual essence, what the mind that makes you, to be reinstantiated in a computer, a very powerful supercomputer, so that your thinking and your memory, your likes and dislikes, your whole personality is not contained within the physical, biological body that you were born with, but is contained within a computer brain. Then you might be able to live as long as that computer or copies of it can exist.
That's right. So here's my objection to that particular idea.
Okay.
This comes from, I actually have an interest in philosophy of mind and cognitive science, and I think that idea is rooted in the currently fairly popular computational theory of mind, which is the basic idea that, at bottom, the human mind is a kind of like a computer program.
Right.
So it is something that you can in fact abstract as a set of logical rules or bits of information, and therefore it's essentially platform independent. Okay.
Right.
I think the computational theory of mind is wrong. That's part of the problem, or at least incomplete. I mean, there are parts of the human nervous system that do seem to work in a fashion similar to what the computational theory of mind predicts. And in particular, the autonomous nervous system. The stuff that controls the heartbeat, the breathing, and all the basic functions of the human body. That seems to work pretty much in a way that it's actually very similar to what the computational theory of mind would predict. But if you actually think about cognitive functions, memories and emotions and so on and so forth, in those terms, I think that's where the theory begins to break down. And the reason it breaks down is because at bottom, and this is, I think, a very ironic point, at bottom, supporters of a computational theory of mind, or if you will, supporters of a strong version of artificial intelligence, are essentially dualists. And I know that this charge is going to come as a surprise because normally these are the last people that think of themselves as dualists. But they are in fact dualists because what they're saying is that there are two things about the human mind. One is the physical substrate that happens to instantiate human thought. That's the brain. And then there is this thing that can be somehow abstracted, and it is platform independent.
Right.
Now, this is not dualism a la Descartes, of course, a la René Descartes, but it is dualism nonetheless. And it seems to me that we have absolutely no reason to believe that we can, in fact, upload, download, or do anything else that is substrate independent with the human thought processes. All we know for sure is that human thought processes are, in fact, inextricably linked to brains. You turn off the brain, you don't have any thought process. We have no evidence whatsoever that you can do otherwise. Let me give you one example from biology that I think might make the case more clear.
Okay.
It is perfectly true, of course, that we can simulate in a computer the logical structure of something that looks like thinking.
Right.
You can write programs that play chess and things of that sort. But simulation is one thing. Doing the actual thing, creating the thing it's another. And I think the point can be understood correctly. The alternative can be understood correctly if we think about another example of biology. Consider photosynthesis, for instance. The ability that most plants have to take energy and materials and turn them into sugars that then use for metabolism. Now, photosynthesis, the process of photosynthesis is well understood at a chemical level, biochemical level. You can simulate the logic of photosynthesis in a computer.
Right.
You're not going to be able to photosynthesize, however, inside a computer. And the reason for that is because photosynthesis as a biological process is inextricably connected to certain particular kinds of molecules that have particular kinds of physical properties.
Well,
and I suspect that the same is true for the brain.
Let me create offer an objection to that reasoning. And that is, if you look at it sort of philosophically, what photosynthesis does is makes use of a process in order to create energy.
Right.
And I don't see any reason why, if you define energy as as substance, if you will, that allows further life in terms of a plant using photosynthesis. You might also be able to create or write a computer program that can operate a process that allows it to create energy or the equivalent of energy that gives it the opportunity for further life or growth.
Sure, but you're not going to have a plant as a result.
Oh no, I agree. It's not going to be a plant, but it could be a simulation of a plant that
Right.
at least looks like, in two-dimensional terms, like a plant and functions like a plant.
Well,
appears
no,
to
that's the
function like a
problem.
plant.
That's the problem. It wouldn't function like a plant unless it had certain biophysical characteristics.
Right. Well, I mean, it wouldn't have those biophysical characteristics unless, of course, it's a clone with a computer brain in it, which is a whole other issue.
That's right.
But I guess I want to go back to the artificial intelligence thing that you raised.
Sure.
If we can make a computer program today that can outthink a human brain in terms of solving chess problems, all right, but that's a very simple and very directed, narrow problem for a computer to solve, and it does it essentially by brute force, by being able to analyze in milliseconds all of the possible outcomes of any given move on a chessboard.
Yes.
You can do it much faster than a human brain, not necessarily better, but faster, and therefore can beat humans most of the time.
Yes.
But that's as I said, that's a simple and narrow application of computer intelligence. However, it does show that something like human thinking can be done on a computer.
I would disagree. I think that what that shows, in fact, that is a really good example, because what that shows is, first of all, I wouldn't even call that intelligence. I would call it computational power. And I don't equate the two. I know that a lot of people do, but I don't. I think we need to make a distinction there. Now, of course, as you know, we could have a whole discussion for a half an hour about what intelligence is or is not, right? But I think you get my meaning, that computational power is not necessarily the same thing as intelligence, because, and that example is in fact a good one. I mean, surely we can write computer programs that beat almost any chess master. Mm-hmm. But they don't do it in anything like the way in which human thought processes work. I mean, people have studied chess masters and chess playing, human chess playing, for a long time. And we know a lot about how these people think and how they operate and so on and so forth. And it doesn't seem to be anything like what a computer does. So my objection is not that you cannot write a computer program that solves a particular task, for instance, playing chess, better, faster than a human being. Of course we can. There's no question about it. But the question is that anything like human thought? And I don't think so. Now, that said, let me sort of reassure our potential viewers that I am not making any mystical argument here.
Okay.
I completely agree with the idea that human beings are biological machines, and that therefore, potentially, we might be able to actually replicate the entire machine. Meaning, cloning, for instance,
right.
or even assembling it somehow. I don't see how at the moment, but somehow assembling a complete human being from scratch.
Right.
We might be able to do that. That's perfectly possible, because if natural selection has done it, I don't see why we shouldn't be able to do it. It's a natural process. What I am objecting to is this idea that we can abstract human thought out of the human, out of the biological characteristics of a human being. To me, thinking is something that brains and things that are similar to brains do, and computers are not similar to brains at all.
But that sounds uncomfortably close to dynamism. That life itself is sort of magical.
Yes,
and it has an essence, a vital essence. Vitalism, I think, is the word I'm looking for.
Right, vitalism. No, I heard that objection before, and I find it interesting because, well, first of all, as I said, by training, I'm a biologist, and I strictly don't believe in vitalism. But the example of the photosynthesis should make clear that I'm not talking about vitalism at all. All I'm saying in the case of the photosynthesis is there's nothing magical about plants' ability to photosynthesize. In fact, we understand that process very, very well, much better than we understand the human brain and how it functions, right? And all that example brings to the forefront, I think, is not that there is anything magical, mystical, or anything about that, but that to be able to photosynthesize, you have to have certain biophysical characteristics. In particular, you have to have some, for instance, some pigments that absorb light and allow it to process in a certain way. If you don't have those, you can abstract the logical structure of the biochemical functions, but you don't have the functions.
So are you saying that in order to be able to think, you have to have certain biological characteristics?
I think that's the best bet. That's right. And now I'm open to the possibility that that is the wrong position,
right.
But so far I see no evidence whatsoever, either from the artificial intelligence community or from the cognitive science community, that that is the case.
All right. Well, let me take an example of an automated attendant. That is, if you phone your bank or sometimes a Travelocity type site. Or sometimes you phone for help on your computer. Anyway, you call a help center, and oftentimes the first thing you're going to get is a computer that will ask you certain questions and kind of guide you toward, sometimes helpfully, often not helpfully, but will attempt to guide you toward where they want you to go to get the satisfaction for what your problem might be.
Right.
If it's done really well, and it's not often done well, but when it is done really well, it's getting close to that, what we call the uncanny valley, where it feels as though you are talking to someone who has a brain, someone who actually can think for themselves, who has a personality. I found myself at times kind of talking back to the recording, the voice on the other end, which often is either a human voice or a very good simulation of a human voice.
Right.
And to the extent where, I can want to engage in an argument. Now, today those automated attendants on the other end of the phone line are not very good. Their voice recognition is fair, but not. It can't understand most words that a human speaks. It can only understand a few specific words.
But they will get better.
Absolutely, they will get better. Right. And in terms of the length of time that technology takes to develop, these things are quite new and rudimentary and only in the very earliest beginning stages. So
we're talking about a version of the Turing Test, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Right.
Yes. And my approach to the Turing Test is if a smart computer can convince you that it has a brain, that it has self-consciousness, if it's well enough designed and has enough a neural network that can allow it to respond abstractly the way a human brain does. If it's designed well enough, programmed well enough, and has enough power, to computational power, that it can convince you that it is self-conscious, then what's the difference between actual self-consciousness, as we call ourselves, and that convincing demonstration?
Well, the difference might be the same as having sex as opposed to simulating sex. The thing is that I find the Turing thought experiment, philosophically flawed. Because all the Turing experiment or test is telling you is that something is behaving in a way that you cannot possibly, reasonably separate from the appearance of the same thought process that human beings have.
Right.
Okay, well, that's a very behavioristic approach toward intelligence. Now, behaviorism is a dead, fortunately, approach to cognitive science. And there's plenty of jokes that we can make about behaviorism. I referred to sex a minute ago, but the typical joke about behaviorists having sex is that at the end of it, one asks the other, it was good for you, how was it for me? Because he has no access to its own internal thought processes. This whole idea the Turing idea seems to be very behavioristic. And by the way, it was a brilliant idea when it was proposed. I mean, this is certainly not a way to criticize Turing for what he was doing and for his idea. But it doesn't address the fundamental philosophical problem of whether you have something that looks like human intelligence as opposed to something that actually is human intelligence. I don't doubt that you can write sophisticated computer programs whose external behavior looks a lot like human behavior. That is possible, although there may be limitations to the extent to which that actually is possible, and we don't know. But it certainly is we're getting better and better doing that sort of thing. But the thing is, at the moment, there is no reason to think that a very complex, sophisticated version of your software that responds to phone inquiries is ever going to develop anything like human consciousness. And I suspect that, again, the reason for that goes back to the biological underpinning of human consciousness. After all, human consciousness, for the little that we know about it, arises as the result of a complex interaction between sort of the logical part of thought processing in the brain and the emotional thought processing in the brain. And those are biological because they're rooted in emotions, fears, desires, and things of that sort. Now, unless you actually are going to be able to somehow build all that stuff into a computer, which would mean incidentally not just having a computer, but having a computer that has sensorial access to the external world and so on and so forth. That seems to me like way along our way out there in terms of technology. But even if it were possible, you still don't have a human consciousness. You have a different kind of intelligence. You don't have a human anymore.
But if it's intelligence that is equal to in its capacity to human intelligence, well then I'm not sure what the objection is to that.
Well, the objection is that you wouldn't be able still to upload yourself because you don't have an equivalent of a lot of the stuff that goes inside the brain into the computer.
Right. Okay. Boy, we're raising all kinds of interesting issues here. I find myself wanting to respond in 5 different directions at once. First of all, let me go to the point you made that an intelligence, even though it might be smart and might be able to reason in certain ways, wouldn't have the same sort of emotions and fears and so on that make us human, and therefore it wouldn't be human. I've always thought that in order for a computer intelligence, an artificial intelligence, to achieve something like human intelligence, human consciousness, it will have to have a physical interaction with the world. That is, it will have to not only be able to think, or that is to absorb ideas, to read what's on the web and so forth, but be able to sense what's going on in the world, be able to have a physical interaction with the world. I agree with you that that's part of what makes humans what we are, is not just what goes on inside our heads, mentally, but the physical interaction we have with life and with others around us in life and with our environments.
Right.
So if a very powerful, supercomputer-based artificial intelligence was not just on a computer platform sitting on a desk someplace, but was inside the brain of a robot, an advanced, sophisticated robot that could move about, that had physical interaction, that had sensory response, could touch and smell and hear and see, etc.
Yes.
Then is that getting closer to, would that intelligence that's inside the computer brain be closer to being able to recapitulate what happens inside human consciousness?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's a fair question. And, it certainly would be an interesting kind of intelligence, for sure. But let me go back. I'm sorry about this particular example, but let me go back to the photosynthesis stuff. So you can say, well, we can build a technological equivalent of the photosynthetic mechanism. And now we have 2 ways to do it, at least 2 ways to do it. There's probably a large number of ways to do it, but there is at least 2 ways to do it. One is we're going to put together the similar or the same kind of biological processes instantiated by similar kinds of biophysical structures. In other words, we're going to create another plant. Okay?
Right.
Fine. We can do that by cloning. We create another plant. We have not certainly... but that wouldn't be that interesting, frankly, because... we know how to do that, and it's certainly possible to do that with a human being, but that's not what we're talking about. Now, the other way would be to build a technological artifact that abstracts the basic principles of photosynthesis and instantiates them in a different way. Well, we know how to do that as well. They're called solar panels. We know how to get energy from the sun and transform it into kinds of energies that we want. But a solar panel, it's not a plant. It's nothing like a plant. It is something that does a formally similar carries out a formally similar kind of activity to a plant, but it's got nothing to do with it. And I suspect that those are the two options that we have in terms of replicating human intelligence. Either we do it biologically, in which case, however, that simply confirms my point, that you have to stick to the biology.
Right.
Or you do it in a very different way, which certainly will result into something very interesting. I, however, don't think I would really call that thing human intelligence. It would be intelligence, for sure. We wouldn't know how and if that thing would develop anything like human emotions, which are an absolute necessary component of being a human. You know, when I was younger, one of my favorite characters, of course, in science fiction was Star Trek's Spock, right? And I was, like a lot of people who are attracted to science and technology and alignment, this whole idea of having only rationality or keeping the emotions under control and all that stuff was very appealing to me. But then I started reading David Hume, one of the, ironically, a philosopher of the Enlightenment. And his point was that you simply can't do that because a fundamental meaning of being human is that you have to have emotions, because if you don't have emotions, you literally don't care about what others are doing or what you yourself are going to do.
And then you become a sociopath. Sort of.
That's right. In fact, we have examples of those around, and we don't like them particularly. Now, is it possible to build something like emotions in a machine the way you're talking about? I don't know. It seems to me that at the moment, at least, emotions are really deeply rooted. Our understanding of emotion is that they're deeply rooted in our biological past. I mean, we share them with other primates and with other mammals, for instance. Take fear. And they arose because of survival reasons. Can we replicate that? Well, we could replicate it by way of an evolutionary process, but again, that wouldn't be too interesting because we know that can be done. Or we could replicate it into something that is going to be looking a lot different from a human being. And then the question remains, is that thing going to have something like human intelligence? It would have intelligence, but I don't think it would have human intelligence, which means, again, that the whole idea of uploading yourself into a hard drive doesn't seem reasonable at all.
Yeah, I agree with you that there are a lot of problems, and I guess I can see arguments on both sides. And I don't think that we'll be able to say, I can't say confidently that uploading, as most transhumanists define it, will be possible until it actually can be achieved. I'm not one of those who has sort of ultimate faith that anything can be done if we can conceive it. There may be reasons why it can't be achieved satisfactorily. I agree with you also, excuse me, however, that some sort of simulation of intelligence or new kind of intelligence, even an apparent self-consciousness, at some point ought to be able to be achieved within a computer, especially a computer that is based within a robot or something that has physical interaction. And that will be really interesting. And I agree with you that it's an experiment that might not be the same as the human experience, but it will certainly be fascinating to see what that is and how it relates to human experience.
Right. But here's another way to look at the problem, which actually is not limited just to the specific issue we're talking about of uploading a human brain or whatever. It's actually more generally applicable to futuristic scenarios. And this is, since I mentioned a minute ago, David Hume, who is arguably my favorite philosophers of all time. He also made another interesting point in a famous essay that he wrote of miracles. And he was talking about not only miracles as in a violation of the natural laws and the supernatural, but he was talking about any kind of extraordinary claims. And famously, astronomer Carl Sagan rephrased Hume's dictum as extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And it seems to me that, for instance, if focusing on what we're talking about for the last few minutes, the claim that it should be possible to, say, upload your human brain to a different kind of device is an incredibly extraordinary claim. I mean, it's one of the most extraordinary claims one can possibly make, given our current understanding of computers, human brains, consciousness, and so on. So I'm not going to say it is impossible. To say that something is impossible, it's a really treacherous and frankly unnecessary territory. Right. All I'm saying is, all right, that seems like a huge claim. Now, you got any evidence? And the evidence is really disturbingly lacking. I've had a correspondence actually a few months ago with Marvin Minsky, for instance, on different topics, and when at some point we started talking about this. And even he admitted that the strong artificial intelligence program has been an abysmal failure. I mean, 30 years ago, people were talking about intelligent computers with a degree of intelligence comparable, or at least in the same ballpark of human, as being around the corner.
Right.
And we're still playing with chess, essentially. We haven't gone past that level. Now, I understand that the objection to that is, well, but just wait and see, and the next technological advancement could be around the corner.
Right.
Sure, it could be. But another way to look at it is actually that there may be a fundamental flaw with the artificial intelligence research program to begin with. And I think that fundamental flaw is the computational theory of mind. If it turns out that the computational theory of mind is wrong, or at least flawed to a large degree, then of course artificial intelligence, the strong program artificial intelligence, wouldn't work. For conceptual reasons, not for technological ones.
So it sounds as though, kind of, to sum up the range of the arguments that you presented and the discussion we've had, that you don't necessarily object to the I guess I should say the ethics, the theory, the general aims behind transhumanism. That is, that it's if science and technology can improve the human experience, can make humans healthier, smarter, longer living, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that, but that you question some of the sort of the theoretical grounding for the more extraordinary claims of transhumanism, in particular uploading and the creation of something like a general artificial intelligence. Am I accurate in...
That's correct. On top of which I would add an extreme degree of caution about the social implications and sort of social development of the human race, about which I tend to be much more skeptical. So yes, I absolutely have nothing against technological improvement of the human condition. In fact, I'm all in favor of it. But I'd rather concentrate our energy on two fronts. First of all, of doing things piecemeal, sort of essentially the precautionary principle, if you will. Mm-hmm. That let's work on things. Let's instead of talking about immortality, let's talk about another 20 years
right.
of good life to be added. By the way, because right now we have extended life, but we haven't actually extended life quality necessarily, right. Because we still have aging. Right?
Yes.
So we do live longer, but unfortunately, what that means is that a larger proportion of our lives is spent in a situation where our physical and mental abilities decline. So let's work on that. How about, for instance, say, we can push human life right now to 80, 90, maybe 100 years or so, give or take a decade. Let's work on making those last 3 decades productive and enjoyable. Productive for society and enjoyable for the human being. And at the same time, let's work on as much progressive and humanist-inspired social change that would then provide us with the basis for, if and when further technological advancement will be possible, then we're going to start it, we're going to implement it from a situation where there's going to be less discrimination, there's going to be less problems with military or corporate abuses, and so on and so forth.
Well, that sounds an awful lot like what I would describe as a techno-progressive orientation. I'm not going to apply a label to you that you're not comfortable with, but
okay.
That's very close to how we define techno-progressivism. I want to push back against one thing that you said there, which is I agree with you that to some extent at least, the success that medical science has had in extending human life has been to extend the end of human life, so that we have more people living in nursing homes and so on. And that's not necessarily improving the quality of human life. And yet at the same time, I think it's pretty clear that the majority of, at least in the Western world, the developed world, the majority of people who are now alive in their let's say their 50s like I am, their 60s, their 70s, are living a much fuller and richer and healthier life than they would have 100 years ago, or certainly 500 or 1,000 years ago.
Yes.
That the quality of life in middle to older age is certainly better, not just because of what we have available around us, but just because we are healthier physically and mentally. So you've heard it said, of course, that 50 is the new 30 or 70 is the new 50 or something like that. I don't think you can say categorically that all we have done is lengthen the period of old age.
No, I completely agree. I certainly didn't mean that as a categorical statement. What I meant to say was that, however, we still are facing huge issues for the last, say, 2 or 3 decades, depending on how you count, of human life. And I think that part of the reason we're facing those issues, by the way, is because we're running into a biological boundary. I mean, evolutionary biologists have also studied aging for a long time, and there's some interesting evidence about how aging works, not just in humans, but in other animal systems. And a good argument based on empirical data has been made that at the moment at least, the human genome, the way it's structured, is such that we reach a biological boundary about around a century and maybe a decade or so. That is, that at that point, no matter what you do, unless short, of course, of altering the human genome per se, which can be done, at least in theory, we're running into some kind of wall. Now, that biological wall is way past reproductive age, or at least what has been historically the reproductive age for human beings.
Right.
Which, of course, reproductive age can also be changing. In fact, it has been changing over the last few decades. But in terms of the human history as a biological species, we're talking about having added several decades past what historically was reproductive age for human beings. Now, biological theory predicts that you're running into a problem at that end of the spectrum, which is natural selection for many generations has purged the human genome, just in the same way it has purged other animals' genomes, of genes that have negative effects before reproductive and during the reproductive age. This often comes as a trade-off. There is a lot of stuff then goes bad later. And natural selection, of course, isn't going to screen those things off, because if it is past reproductive age, then there is no biological point in screening, in improving the genome. So we're running into a situation where we live now longer, significantly longer, past the screening ability of natural selection to eliminate bad stuff from our genome, which is why we're now seeing an increase in diseases, in late onset diseases. Mm-hmm. Alzheimer's, of course, being the obvious case, but there's many others. An increased occurrence of cancer, for instance, late in life, and so on and so forth. Running into serious biological problems, which, of course, potentially could be solved. I'm not saying that there is no solution to those things. But what they're doing at the moment is they are, in fact, significantly decreasing the quality of life of a large number of people during the last decade, 2 decades, or 3 decades. I mean, Alzheimer's itself is a huge problem. And it's experienced by an increasing proportion of the population precisely because we have the technology to increase the lifespan, but we don't have the technology, at least at the moment, to fix the problems that emerge as a result. All I'm saying here, however, is, again, not that therefore we should just stop because nothing can be done about it, but it is a good example of how a simple, say, extension of human life mm-hmm. is actually raising a lot of problems that are they're going to be very difficult to solve.
I agree with you on that, and in fact, that kind of would lead to a whole new discussion. We're going to have to wrap up for today, however, and I hope we have a chance to do this again, because I would really like to start with the question of whether progress is a good thing. I think we could have a really interesting conversation about whether technological progress as a whole has benefited humanity. Sort of from the standpoint of are we in general happier and better off now than we were, say, 10,000 years ago or 100,000, 50,000 years ago in the hunter-gatherer phase?
Right.
Those are really interesting questions, and I think we could have another good long conversation about those.
It would be my pleasure.
And I really appreciate your time today. We've covered a lot of ground. There's so many more things that we could talk about. Is there anything kind of as a final word that you want to get in before we wrap up?
Well, the only last point I would like to make is, again, that mine is certainly not a radical critique of the transhumanist goals, and I am a humanist myself. It's just that I rather go much more slowly and considering the whole picture, not just the technology.
Okay. Well, that's a fair position, and I think we probably, you and I, agree more than we disagree. And hopefully we found enough points of disagreement here that it would make interesting viewing for people. So we'll look forward to seeing in the comments how people think about our 2 points of view. Anyway, thank you very much, Massimo. It's been great to talk with you.
It was a pleasure.
All right. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.